সুপ্রিয় দর্শক সবাইকে স্বাগত জানাচ্ছি টিভিএন 24 টেলিভিশন আয়োজিত নিয়মিত অনুষ্ঠান টিভিএন অ্যানালিসিস। আমি হাবিব রহমান আছি আপনাদের সাথে। আজ বেশ কয়েকটি গুরুত্বপূর্ণ বিষয় নিয়ে আমরা আলোচনা করব। কয়েকটি ব্যাপার আছে এখনই জানিয়ে রাখতে চাই সেগুলি। একটি হচ্ছে টেনেন্টস রাইট, ল্যান্ডলর্ডস রাইট। এই দুটি ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট বিষয় আমরা ডিটেলস আলোচনা করবো। এছাড়াও যেটি থাকবে ডিভোর্স, বিস্তারিত কিছু আলোচনা থাকবে। ডিভোর্স স্ত্রীকে কি পেতে পারেন, কেন পেতে পারেন, চাইল্ড সাপোর্টে হতে পারে, কি কারণে হতে পারে, এবং ডিভোর্স আগে, বিয়ের আগে অনেকে প্রিনাপ করতে পারেন। এই সমস্ত বিষয়ে আলোচনা করার জন্য আজ স্টুডিওতে আমার সাথে আছেন রিচার্ড জার্কো। ওয়েলকাম ওয়ান্স again.
Thank you. It's
we
good
had
to be back.
last show last month.
October.
Yeah, it was fun.
October 24th to be exact.
And we have your partner with us.
Yes.
Attorney Sheikh Salim. He's also with us. কেমন Attorney Sheikh Salim, শুনতে পাচ্ছেন আমাকে?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Perfect. বেশ কিছু গুরুত্বপূর্ণ বিষয় নিয়ে আজকে আলোচনা করব আমরা, দর্শকদের জানিয়ে রাখলাম। So, Rich, let's start with the wife entitled to divorce in New York. What is a wife is entitled for? Let's start with that first, and then, I mean, this is where we left off last episode. So let's start there.
Well, let's not confuse the idea of entitlement with what she would receive automatically. Everything in divorce is negotiable except for child support. However, the entitlement means that she's eligible to receive it, and most of the time the courts grant it. So she can receive spousal support in the form of maintenance. Certainly she would receive child support. If you have property together, then you would have what they call equitable distribution of the property, where the courts would evaluate all the property in the aggregate that the parties hold together jointly, and then divide it based on what's equitable. It's not necessarily 50-50. It could be 60-40. It could be 50-50. And it also depends on how much spousal support she's receiving in maintenance.
So let's bring up an example just for clarity.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you two examples. One where a person makes a certain amount of money and has a child.
Right.
And make believe wife has the custody of the child. In this scenario, we also make believe that husband is making 10 grand a month.
Okay. So, well, when we talk about custody, the first thing we want to understand is that the courts don't award joint custody, joint legal custody. The presumption is that the parties couldn't get along to begin with, which is why they're getting divorced. And so the court won't assume that the parties can actually get along well enough to co-parent the child. However, if you agree to joint custody, the court will say, that's great, that's better, we don't have to actually have a custody hearing, we accept that 100%, we prefer that you do it that way. So even if you have joint legal custody, and let's say the parties are sharing the child 50-50, meaning 3 days at my house, 4 days at your house, and then the next week it's 4 days at my house and 3 days at her house, there still needs to be a custodial parent with respect to child support, because the court needs to know which parent is paying and which parent is receiving. So now child support is not negotiable. If you decide to deviate from the basic support obligation, or if you decide to waive it, then the court wants to know why, and the court will actually need to approve that. So the court will actually conduct a hearing. But assuming that you're sticking to the basic support obligation, let's say you have one child. So let's say the husband makes $100,000 a year and the wife makes $50,000 a year. So what they do is they combine the income of both parents and then take a percentage of that income less certain deductions, which is for, say, FICA and New York City tax, Medicare payments, and then what they do from that is they attach a percentage to the aggregate. So that would be, for one child in New York State, it's 17% of that aggregate income. And there's a cap. The cap changes every year. It grows every year. I think the cap right now is above $150,000. But for the purposes of this discussion, we'll keep it at 150,000. So what they do is they take the prorated percentage of each spouse. So on 150,000, if the wife is making 50, then that's 1/3. So then that's 1/3 of the obligation she's required to pay and 2/3 of the obligation that the husband is supposed to pay. So that would be roughly, say, $2,100 a month, 17% of 150,000, which means that the husband would be obligated to pay the wife $1,400 a month, and the court just assumes that the wife, through taking care of the child, is naturally paying out the $700 a month that she conceivably or technically that she owes.
So that's how it is, and it's simply put. If no child is involved,
well, then there's no child support, and then it's a matter of whether or not the court awards spousal support. It's not automatic the way it is with child support. So with spousal support, there are a couple of ways that you can get it. The parties can agree to it, and that makes it easier for everybody. If not, then what the wife's attorney would do is the wife's attorney would file an order to show cause, which is an emergency motion seeking pendente lite support or interim support. And essentially, at that point, the wife's attorney would lay out all the financial details of the wife's life, as well as the husband's details, come up with the calculation. There are two calculations. The court is required to accept the lower of the two unless there are exigent circumstances that the court would need to consider if the court wants to deviate from the basic support obligation, and then determine that award.
Okay, so this part I need to go to Attorney Sheikh Salim and get some clarity, because I think many of us will be hearing this for the first time, that divorce took place, a wife still can ask for support.
Yes.
And this is by law.
Well, by law, she's entitled to, but the court is not obligated to award it.
Is not obligated. So let's go to him. Let's get some clarity in our own language. Attorney Sheikh Salim, আপনি আমাকে শুনতে পাচ্ছেন? খুব গুরুত্বপূর্ণ একটি কথা বলেছেন রিচার্ড জার্কো, দ্যাট আপনি যদি ডিভোর্সের পরেও ওয়াইফ কিন্তু হাজবেন্ডের কাছ থেকে সাপোর্ট দাবি করতে পারেন। এই ব্যাপারটি যদি আপনি একটু পরিষ্কার করে আমাদের বুঝিয়ে বলেন সবাইকে।
ওকে, অ্যাকচুয়ালি ডিভোর্স যখন হয়ে যায় তখনও কোর্ট স্পাউজাল সাপোর্ট দিতে পারে। আপনি লক্ষ্য করেন কথাটা স্পাউজাল, ইটস নট অনলি ওয়াইফ। এটা যদি ওয়াইফ মেইন ব্রেড অ্যান্ড বাটার আর্নার হয় ফ্যামিলিতে, হাজব্যান্ড অন্য সাপোর্ট দেয় বা অন্যভাবে করে, ওয়াইফের ইনকাম অনেক বেশি বা হাজব্যান্ডের ইনকাম অনেক বেশি, তো সাপোর্ট দিয়ে লাইফস্টাইল একজন আর একজনের কাছ থেকে আবার সাপোর্ট চাইতে পারে। স্পাউজাল সাপোর্ট, খোরপোশ আমরা বাংলায় যেটা বলি, ঠিক আছে। আর একটু অ্যাড করি আমি রিচার্ডের সাথে, যে বলছে যে ওই $150,000 একটা সার্টেন ডিডাকশনে পরে, ইউজুয়ালি ইন নিউ ইয়র্ক 11.4% ডিডাকশনে পরে, দ্য রেস্ট অফ দ্য অ্যামাউন্ট ইজ সাবজেক্ট টু চাইল্ড সাপোর্ট। সো সেইটা হলো আর বলতেছে যে স্পাউজাল সাপোর্ট দেওয়ার নিয়ম আছে, ইটস নট অটোমেটিক লাইক চাইল্ড সাপোর্ট। চাইল্ড সাপোর্ট চাইল্ড থাকলে দিতেই হবে প্যারেন্টের, দেয়ার ইজ নো ওয়ে আউট, দিতে হবে, ম্যান্ডেটরি। স্পাউজাল সাপোর্টটা ম্যান্ডেটরি না, যেমন এই যে কোর্টের ডিসক্রিশনারি এবং কোর্টের মর্জি সমস্ত ফ্যাক্টস বিবেচনা করে। যেমন ধরেন আমি একটা উদাহরণ দিই, হাজবেন্ড ওয়াইফ দুইজনেই কাজ করে, দুইজনেই ইয়াং, কারো কোনো সিকনেস নাই, কিছুই নাই। কোর্ট ইন দ্যাট কেস, you go and work and support yourself, he is going his way, go and support himself. I'm not awarding anything, but usually যারা পায় যে সমস্ত কেসে, তো প্রতি 3 বছর বিয়ের জন্য 1 বছরের সাপোর্ট দেওয়া হয়। অর্থাৎ কেউ যদি 9 বছর বিয়ে করে, সে 3 বছরের সাপোর্ট পাইতে পারে ডিভোর্সের পরে। সো দ্যাটস বেসিক্যালি ইট। সেক্ষেত্রে কোর্ট সমস্ত সার্কামস্টেন্স বিবেচনা করে যেটা করতে পারে সেইটা। বেসিক্যালি দ্যাটস দ্য সারমর্ম রিচার্ড যা বললো এইটাই
Ji, thank you. Thank you. I mean, you already mentioned caps, so I'm not going to touch on that anymore. Because it depends on things. I'm just going to. There are two questions I want to raise. One is, and these questions are coming from people who are suffering. Sure. So one question is, why does my ex keep changing his lawyers? This is a divorce case again.
Sure. I mean, there could be a number of reasons. Frequently, clients might not be satisfied with or happy with the direction of the litigation. Maybe they are not satisfied with the services of the attorney. So they fire the attorney and hire a new one. Also, frequently attorneys have the freedom to withdraw from representation for any number of reasons. So, for instance, if you stop paying, the attorney is not obligated to continue working on your case for no payment. Additionally, there could be a conflict between the attorney and the client. The client wants the attorney to do something. The attorney doesn't want to do it or doesn't think it's advisable. Maybe the attorney believes it's an ethical violation. So you have a deterioration of the attorney-client relationship. And when that happens, the attorney is free to withdraw. If the client is asking the attorney to commit an act that the attorney believes is an ethical violation or something illegal, the attorney is required to withdraw. So there are a number of reasons.
Can somebody do it intentionally to delay the entire process? Is it possible?
It's a dilatory tactic, sure. I've had clients that, I mean, I took a case a couple of years ago where I was the 8th attorney on the case. And I had advanced that case further than any other attorney had. And the client asked me to do something that I didn't want to do, that I thought was unethical, and I withdrew. And, you know, the other side, while they didn't object to me withdrawing for the sake of it, and the court certainly wouldn't force me to continue representing this person if this person was asking me to do something that I believed was unethical. But simultaneously, the court was aware that I was the 8th attorney on this case in a matter of 5 years, and that this was a pattern for this particular client. So, yes.
Yeah. That goes against that person anyway. I mean, if the court values and sees it through that delay technique.
Delay tactics, the court does not take kindly to that.
Correct.
I mean, it's one thing if you legitimately have a reason to change your lawyer, and then there are mandatory stays or discretionary stays that the court will give. So if you have a withdrawal of your attorney, then the court will, it's in the court's discretion to grant a 30-day period where no activity will occur on that case for the client to obtain a new attorney. However, if the attorney dies or becomes incapacitated or is disbarred, then that stay is automatic. Even if the court doesn't know about the condition of this attorney, that stay will then be retroactively imposed based on the date of accrual of whatever the attorney's incapacity. And then at that point, the other side would actually need permission from the court to continue the case, and that stay is longer than 30 days. That stay is indefinite until the client knows and is aware and is given 30 days to actually find new counsel.
One last question on this one. What does conflicted out mean for lawyers?
That means that there is potentially a conflict of interest. So, for instance, you see a lot of this, for instance, in divorces where there's a history of immigration cases prior to that. So let's say the husband is a citizen and the wife is not, and they get married, and then she obtains papers like a green card or whatever it is, and then she claims that, well, the divorce deteriorated for whatever, I mean, the marriage deteriorated for whatever the reason, and she's seeking a divorce, and then she goes back to the attorney that handled the immigration. Well, that's a conflict of interest because he represented the husband, and now the wife wants him to represent her against the husband when he was originally the husband's attorney. So there are conflicts there that the attorney cannot engage, and the attorney would need to recuse himself and not accept representation.
I see. So let's go back to our meat of the discussion today, which is tenants landlord topic.
product.
I know for many of us, this is not as pleasant as it sounds, and it's a painful process for many of us.
Sure.
But let's start with one fundamental thing, and then we'll go back to Sheikh Salim just to get some more clarity.
Absolutely.
Because everybody needs to understand this. What are the tenants' rights in New York? We're talking about New York in general. You can segment that saying, hey, this 5 boroughs is different from these 2 counties.
Right.
That's up to you.
Actually, the 5 boroughs, all 5 counties of New York are the same. It's a little different when you get outside of New York City. So Yonkers, Nassau, Suffolk, they have Westchester. I mean, they have some different laws. There are additional laws within New York, like the rent stabilization law within New York City. However, I mean, tenants' rights is pretty broad, but when you're dealing with eviction, you're dealing with a process, and landlords are precluded in a lot of ways. Actually, let me refine that. So there are several types of summary proceedings, which is what they call an action in court to evict somebody that a landlord could bring. The 2 most common are non-payment proceedings and summary holdover proceedings. So a non-payment proceeding is when you owe a lot of money in rent and they say, well, we're bringing you to court to collect the rent, and if you don't pay it, then we're going to evict you, and this is what we're trying to do. And then there's a summary holdover proceeding, which is essentially either you committed a violation of the lease, so if your lease is still active and it hasn't expired yet, then if you breach the lease or violate the lease or commit certain other acts that are precluded under the law, then the landlord can bring that action against you. But that's a much more difficult action for a landlord to prosecute than say, well, if the lease expired and you're not getting out and he doesn't want to continue to renew you, if you're on a market rate lease, then the landlord has no obligation to give you a new lease. And at that point, the landlord can simply serve you notice and then bring you to court to evict you.
Okay, this is the process for eviction, non-payment and procedural. But what are the rights, the tenants' rights? If you were to say these are the 5 or 10 or 2 rights that they're entitled to.
The most fundamental right is the warranty of habitability. It's not so much a right as much as it's an obligation of the landlord to make sure that the apartment is fit to be lived in. It's fit for habitation. And that means heat and hot water. That means working plumbing. That means electricity. That means free from vermin and pests and rodents and roaches. That means that the structural integrity of the unit is safe. There are no violations of code. You have multiple means of egress, which is exit in the event of emergency, depending on when the building was built, whether or not the building code required a retrofitting, say, for sprinkler systems or interior fire safety prevention. So these are all rights that the tenants have. The tenants also are free from have the right against rent gouging. So, a lot of the times landlords will unnecessarily jack up the rent. Now, when you are in regulated housing, then those rents are capped and those rents are regulated and the landlords can't. But people who are unsophisticated and don't realize that they have a regulated lease can be the victims of that. If you're in a market rate apartment and there are no regulations on it, then the landlords can change the rent anytime after the lease expires. So you have a lease for a year, say for $1,500 a month, and the landlord learns that he's been undercharging you and he could get $2,500 a month at the expiration of that lease. The landlord can turn around, as long as he gives you enough notice prior to the termination of that lease, and say, hey, listen, I'm increasing your rent by $1,000 a month. There's nothing to stop him from doing that.
Okay, so I think this is where we want to hear more from Sheikh Salim. Sheikh Salim, আমরা ডিসকাস করছিলাম টেনেন্টস রাইটস। আপনি যদি একটু পরিষ্কার করে বলেন আমাদের সবার জন্য, যারা ভিউয়ার্স আছেন এখন দেখছেন পরে দেখবেন, সবার জন্য সুবিধা হবে।
শিওর। ইন এ লিজড অ্যাপার্টমেন্ট, যারা ইজারা নেয় অ্যাপার্টমেন্ট থাকে, তাদের রাইট, তাদের এটা ল্যান্ডলর্ডের কর্তব্য যে অ্যাপার্টমেন্টটা বা বাড়িটা ভাড়া দেওয়া হয়েছে সেখানে লিভেবল হয়, অর্থাৎ heat, hot water, electricity, working conditions, কোনো রকমের হ্যাজার্ড কন্ডিশন নাই, সেইটাই একটা। অফ কোর্স টেনান্টস হ্যাজ দ্যাট রাইট, তার ভালোভাবে বাস করার মতো উপযোগী অ্যাপার্টমেন্ট সেইটা। তারপরে টেনান্টের টেনান্ট মানে কোনো প্রকার ল্যান্ডলর্ডের থেকে কোনো প্রকার উস্কানি বা ধরেন ইন্টারফারেন্স করতে পারবে না, এগুলো সব টেনান্টসের রাইট আছে। এবং কাকরোচ, রোচেস, নিট অ্যান্ড ক্লিন, সেটা তাদের ব্যাপার, নিট অ্যান্ড ক্লিন রাখবে, তাই না? যে বাস করে সে তার রেসপন্সিবিলিটি। তারা আননেসেসারিলি নোটিশ ছাড়া বিভিন্ন মেয়াদের লিজের বিভিন্ন মেয়াদের নোটিশ আছে, নোটিশ তারা বলে যাওয়া যাবে না তুমি চলে যাও। যেগুলো আনরেগুলেটেড 1 to 5 ফ্যামিলি হাউসেস, এখানে রেগুলেশন নাই, এটা রেন্ট ইনক্রিজ করতে পারে লিজ শেষ হওয়ার পরে এনি অ্যামাউন্ট, সেখানে কোনো ক্যাপ নাই। কিন্তু রেগুলেটেড অ্যাপার্টমেন্ট যেগুলা রেন্ট স্টেবিলাইজ, সেখানে ক্যাপ আছে, এই কয় পার্সেন্টের বেশি বাড়ানো যায় না। এবং মোর দেন 6 ফ্যামিলি হইলে সেখানে কেউ থাকলে দে হবে, তাদের রাইট আছে রিনিউ লিজ রিনিউ করার, এন্ড ল্যান্ডলর্ড সেটা রিফিউজ করতে পারে না রিনিউ করলে, অ্যাজ লং অ্যাজ দে পে রেন্ট। তারা রেন্ট পে করলে তাদের ইভিক্ট করা খুবই কঠিন ব্যাপার।
থ্যাংক ইউ।
আরেকটা বলছেন নন পেমেন্ট, নন পেমেন্ট প্রসিডিং, সেখানে পেমেন্ট না দিলে যে কেউ ল্যান্ডলর্ড যে ইভিকশন প্রসিডিং করে তাদের ইভিক্ট করতে পারে।
জি,
সেখানে হয়তো ভ্যারিয়াস ডিফেন্স থাকে বিভিন্ন ভাবে, যে কি সিচুয়েশনে পারে, আবার পেমেন্ট দিয়ে দিলে আবার করতে পারে না। আরেকটা বলছে যে এক্সপায়ার্ড লিজ, শেষে সেখানে যদি তারা ল্যান্ডলর্ড ইলেক্ট করতে পারে লিজ টার্মিনেট করে দেবে।
জি,
হোল্ড ওভার প্রসিডিং, যে হোল্ড করতেছে লিজ এক্সপায়ার হওয়ার পরে হোল্ড ওভার প্রসিডিং করতে পারে। ইউজুয়ালি নন রেগুলেটেড যেগুলোতে নিয়ন্ত্রিত বাড়ি না বা অ্যাপার্টমেন্ট না, সেখানে তাদের ইভিক্ট করতে পারে।
ওকে,
কিন্তু যদি রেগুলেটেড হয় তাইলে আবার ইভিক্ট করা কঠিন ব্যাপার হয়ে দাঁড়ায়।
ওকে, সো জাস্ট সো দ্যাট আমরা সবাই বুঝি, 1 to 5 ফ্যামিলি অ্যাপার্টমেন্টগুলো ইটস নট রেগুলেটেড। যদি 6-এর উপরে চলে যায় যে বিল্ডিংগুলো আছে রেগুলেটেড,
6 বা
6 and
You
up.
need six. You need
And
six.
that's when, I mean, 1 to 5, the landlord can raise the landlord যে কোনো পরিমাণ ভাড়া বাড়াতে পারে, আপনি মানা করতে পারবেন না। কিন্তু 6 and up, there is a regulation.
Right. There's one thing I want to add to that also. So when your apartment is regulated under rent stabilization law, there's another fundamental right that tenants have, and that is the right to renew the lease. So in an unregulated apartment, the landlord doesn't have to renew the lease. They just say, listen, your lease is expiring. As long as they give enough notice, I'm not intending to renew your lease. Thank you very much. And they don't even need to give a reason necessarily. On a regulated apartment under rent stabilization law, the landlord is required to offer a renewal lease between 150 and 90 days prior to the expiration of the lease. Now, if you don't renew the lease and you don't sign it for whatever the reason, then the landlord has an opportunity or has the right to evict you as a holdover. However, if you can show a reason why you didn't sign it, I was injured, I was sick, I was in the hospital, I didn't get it, and the landlord didn't serve it on time, or whatever it is, the courts are very generous with saying, listen, his reasons are valid, and all you have to do is sign the lease, and then that's the end of that case.
I have a very relevant question.
Sure.
Many of the questions. One, I must take this. Jenny Hassan, আমি আপনার প্রশ্নটি নিচ্ছি. He wrote, my brother's tenant is not paying rent for the last 3 years. Why the eviction process is so biased? Why would it blindly support the tenant and don't think of the law needs a lot of revision, corrections, or upgrade? Yeah, that part I agree.
Wow. Well, first of all, I mean, if I'm looking at it from 30,000 feet, I only have limited information.
Correct.
I will tell you this: the landlord-tenant laws in New York are construed from the perspective of protecting the tenant first. That said, what I tell clients is the only thing the court really has to give out right now is time. And the court is giving out a lot of time. One, because the dockets are full and the courts are overloaded, especially after COVID, when you had a whole slew of foreclosure not foreclosure, of evictions
yes.
Being commenced or resumed after the moratoria were lifted. But it takes that long because you're also dealing with issues of due process. So when you're dealing with property rights, if you lease an apartment, even if you're not paying rent, you have a property right in that lease. You have a property right in the occupancy of that apartment. So that's protected by due process, which means that you're entitled to an attorney. If you can't afford an attorney, then the court will appoint one. Or they'll actually make a referral. The court won't appoint it. They'll make a referral to an or multiple organizations that provide pro bono or free legal advice or free legal representation. It's no guarantee that they'll be able to accept you. The point I'm making is that it's designed to give the tenant every opportunity to fight and contest and defend in these actions. And unfortunately, the landlords pay the brunt of that. And when you are a homeowner and it's a two-family home and you're trying to make a little extra money on your home to help pay the mortgage and you're just a working person like anybody else, that's the most unfortunate part. You're not some big management company that's bringing in, hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in rent, and you can afford, okay, this one particular tenant isn't paying. It's just a drop in the bucket.
Right. I'm just going to tell Janib Hassan, I don't know, just like Mr. Zarco was saying, he doesn't have all the details. We just have two pieces of information. That's 3 years he's not paying rent and what is happening, right? So in order to really get some help, one thing is you need a good lawyer. That's for sure. Your brother should reach out to Zarco's office. And I'm not, pushing for any sales. Because based on my conversation with him, I know what I hear. আমি জানি ওনার সাথে আমার অনেক কথাবার্তা হয় এবং based on those discussions আমি জানি ওনার expertise টা কি. So have him call him.
You also have, I'm sorry, I just want to interject one thing.
3 years is too long.
One second.
You also have to remember that 3 years ago we were still in the middle of COVID.
Correct.
And
that's
so there was an eviction moratorium on non-payment of rent.
Correct.
You also have the possibility, well, if he hasn't paid rent in years, then he could have applied for ERAP funds. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But nonetheless, the courts were, and eviction actions were stayed. There was a moratorium on it for failure to pay rent.
So there are issues that we don't know. There are things that we don't know.
Right.
We don't know what took place. Is he part of the ERP applicants? We don't know.
Right.
Right. So best thing is to get a good lawyer, please. 3 years is too long. Sheikh Salim, আপনি কিছু বলছিলেন খুব দ্রুত, কারণ আমি আরেকটি
না, আমি ওই বলছি যে 3 years is too long.
Right.
আমাদের কাছে enough information নাই কেন 3 years এ তারা রাখছে.
Correct.
It's unlikely যে 3 years লোকজন থাকতে পারে without payment. There might be other issue we don't know.
All right. So now that brings me to another question. How long can a tenant live on a property without paying?
Technically, you can live there for a long time. It's up to the landlord to actually bring the action. The landlord has a bit of a catch-22 situation here, because if first of all, you need to serve the demands in rent. So you need to serve a 14-day demand that rent is due, and you need to pay the rent by X amount of date, or we will start an eviction action against you. However, 1 month or 2 months, you're going to pay an attorney and go into court, and then it's a very easy thing to settle. As soon as the tenant pays that back, well, then your case is dismissed because you no longer have an arrears
situation. Right.
So what the landlords do is they wait until the arrears accrue significantly enough where the tenant can't afford to pay that back, and so then what they do do is they get a judgment. But that doesn't mean that the tenant can't fight it and can't drag it out, and conceivably drag out
As long as
a
possible.
case for a year and a half,
Right.
even.
Okay. How many notice a landlord has to serve before actually taking steps for eviction?
Well, it depends on the type of eviction. So if it's a holdover proceeding, say you're a monthly tenant. Let's say you don't have a lease and you're in a market rate apartment and you're just paying rent every month, and the landlord decides, you know what, for whatever reason, I'm terminating your lease. Depending on the amount of time that you've been in the apartment, will determine the length of the notice. So if it's a year or less, then it's only a 30-day notice of termination, meaning that by the end of this month, let me clarify that. So they have to serve the notice within a month, and then they get the succeeding month, the entire month, in order to vacate. If it's between 1 year and 2 years, it's a 60-day notice. Anything above 2 years is a 90-day notice. So now, conceivably, if a person's been in an apartment for 3 or 4 years and you want to do a holdover, you have to wait more than 90 days just before you're able to actually start the eviction. So you need to serve a notice of termination. And then once that notice is ignored and the party doesn't vacate and he's in the premises without your permission, then you go and you start a holdover proceeding.
Can a landlord evict you without going to a court?
Nope. The only way the landlord can evict you without going to court is if the apartment if there's a vacate order from the Department of Buildings. So let's say it's an illegal basement apartment and you have a lot of those. The landlords not only are not allowed to rent those, but they're not allowed to collect rent on them. And you can stop paying that, and maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but the point is that if the Department of Buildings finds out that this apartment is occupied and it qualifies as what they call an R3, which is the classification under the multiple dwelling law of say of a 1 or 2 family home, and you have a basement apartment that you're not allowed, that doesn't meet the code and you're not allowed to be renting, they could put a vacate order on that and say, well, this apartment is not fit for human habitation, and refuse to allow you back in. But that's in very extreme and rare circumstances. The fact of the matter is that the landlord must get a court order in order to evict you, and then even after they get the order to evict, the court not only has to issue the order, the warrant of eviction, but has to sign off on the execution of the warrant of eviction, meaning it could be stayed, or it's stayed for a specific amount of time, or it could be stayed indefinitely, or it's allowed to be executed immediately, which then means the requisition has to go to the marshal, and the marshal then has an entire process that the marshal needs to follow in order to get the court to sign off on service of the notice of eviction.
Attorney Sheikh Salim.
না ঠিকই আছে বলছে কি যে সমস্ত বাড়িতে ধরেন ইলিগাল অ্যাপার্টমেন্ট আছে সেখানতে ল্যান্ডলর্ড রেন্ট কালেক্ট করতে পারে না পারে না আর বলছে যে এর আগে বলছে যে টার্ম অফ দ্য লিজের উপরে নির্ভর করে কত দিনের লিজ 4 ইয়ার্স হলে 90 ডেজ 2 ইয়ার্স এর বেশি হলে 60 ডেজ ওয়ান্স লেস দেন 1 ইয়ার হলে 30 ডেজ নোটিশ দিতে হবে এর ভিতরে যদি তারা চলে যায় তাহলে চলে যাইতে পারে আর যদি তখন তো আর ল্যান্ডলর্ড টাকা পাচ্ছে না 60-90 ডেজের ভিতরে still she remains obligable ওই যে এটা কিন্তু টাকাটা তো না দিয়ে চলে যায় ম্যাক্সিমাম ল্যান্ডলর্ড ইউজুয়ালি বদার করে না আর বলছে যে যদি ধরেন ইলিগাল বেসমেন্ট থাকে ইলিগাল অ্যাপার্টমেন্ট থাকে সেখানতে আইনি নাই রেন্ট কালেক্ট করার বা ওই লিগালি যে রেন্ট কালেক্ট করতে পারে না তো তারপরে আবার রেন্ট এন্টায়ার প্রসিজার হচ্ছে কেন কি যে ল্যান্ডলর্ড টেনান্টে আপনি জাজমেন্ট পাইলেন ওকে জাজমেন্টের এভিকশনটা পাইলেন কিন্তু এইটা আবার মার্শালের কাছে যাবে মার্শালের কাছে গেলে মার্শালের আবার একটা প্রসেস তারা অ্যাকচুয়াল ওয়ারেন্ট অফ এভিকশন নেবে ওয়ারেন্ট সেইটা নিয়ে তারা এক্সিকিউট করে তাদের বাইর করে দিতে পারে এই আলো প্রসিজার আর কি এইটা
One last question on this one. We didn't touch on something which is prenup. I'm going to go there later.
That's fine.
What is an actual process for a landlord to proceed with eviction?
depending on the type of eviction. So after you serve the requisite notices, and that's really important, because if you don't serve the requisite notice, if you don't serve it properly, if the content of the notice doesn't comply with the law, if you don't clearly state the section of the law that you're seeking eviction, if you don't state that you intend to evict at the culmination of this period of time, if you either don't pay the rent or if you don't vacate by a certain date. So if the notice has any defects in it, your case is done, which means that you'll have to reserve the notice and you'll have to refile. If the notices are served properly and the content of the notice is proper, then what you do is you go and you file a notice of petition and petition with the court. Now that has to be served, so the court will actually assign an appearance date, so the first date that you're supposed to appear in court, and then service is supposed to occur no more than 17 days before the court appearance, and no less than 12 days. I know I'm getting into the weeds, but it's time. And it all factors in. So, and the timing has to be precise in order for your case to be valid. So then once you do that, and then you get into court, then you have an entire other procedure once you're in court about how to navigate and litigate this case.
Okay, so I'm going to jump into a topic that we started off with, divorce, but some people can really safeguard themselves with something called prenup.
Yes.
I know this is not really well known for most of us, so let's start there. What is a prenup? How can one really use it or utilize it to safeguard themselves? Both, man and woman, doesn't matter.
A prenuptial agreement is an agreement. It's a contract that parties engage and parties sign that is designed to safeguard their possessions or certain rights or certain positions that they have prior to getting married. Most of the time it's used where if you have one party is wealthy or one party has a lot of assets and the other party doesn't have that many, or both parties are very well situated financially and have their assets, and they want to keep their assets separate. So then they will draft the prenuptial agreement with respect to making sure that their assets are safeguarded and that their assets don't get commingled during marriage and then be subject to equitable distribution. Also, you will have sometimes very wealthy men marrying not so wealthy women, and so there can be provisions with respect to spousal support or spousal maintenance in something like that. So there are a lot of details that go into a prenuptial agreement, but essentially they're designed to safeguard and protect parties' positions prior to getting married.
Did you mention Anna Nicole Smith?
I didn't mention Anna Nicole Smith. Here's.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Listen, you know what I mean.
That's one of those examples.
That was in Texas, so it's a different body of law that governs in Texas. But Anna Nicole Smith, I don't know the details of her prenuptial agreement, but I also know that. Okay, but there you go. So I also know that her husband was very old and he changed his will several times, and they don't know whether or not he was fit mentally or competent to have changed his will. That was a very messy, ugly situation. I just don't have the details to be able to comment on.
If you don't know, Anna Nicole Smith was 24 years old. This man was 90-some years old.
90-something years old,
right? And he was a billionaire.
He was a very wealthy oil man.
In Texas. Okay? And Anna Nicole Smith তাকে বিয়ে করেছিলেন এবং property তিনি পেয়েছিলেন. Even though he had kids, grown-up sons and daughters. But it was an ugly, messy situation because they did not have a prenup.
Right.
Or he did not have a prenup.
But he changed his will several times to name her, and it was fought over in the courts.
Right. I mean, it's a widely known story of, everybody knows.
Right.
I mean,
I don't know it well enough to comment on it on the show.
I think it's about 20 years, maybe.
It's been a while. I know Anna Nicole Smith is deceased as well. So
have you seen a daughter? It's a speed copy.
No, I thought she had a son, but I don't know that she had a daughter. I don't really
exactly like her.
I don't know that many details about Anna Nicole Smith. She was a tragic figure, unfortunately.
She was. Okay, so Sheikh Salim, আমরা আপনার কাছে একটু যাব। এই প্রিনাপের ব্যাপারটা যদি 2 মিনিটের মধ্যে একটু বুঝিয়ে বলেন অনেকের জন্য, কারণ অনেকের কাছে আমাদের কাছে প্রিনাপ ব্যাপারটা পরিষ্কার না।
প্রিনাপ এবং পোস্ট নাপ দুইটা জিনিস আছে। যেমন ধরেন প্রিনাপসে বিবাহের পূর্বে যারা ব্রাইড এন্ড গ্রুম মানে বর কনে চুক্তি করে যে আমার এই থাকবে, আমার সেপারেট, তোমার এই তোমার থাকবে, তোমার ইনকাম তোমার, আমার ইনকাম আমার, অথবা অনেক সময় দেখা যাবে ওয়াইফ বলবে আমার ইনকাম আমার, তোমার ইনকাম আমাদের দুইজনের, এরকম হয় আর কি। সব এই চুক্তিতে আপনি সবকিছু ডিভাইড করতে পারেন যে ওকে আমি আমার ফ্যামিলি কাছ থেকে এই ইনহেরিটেন্স পাইছি, ইজ গোয়িং টু বি মাইন, ইভেন তুমি এরপরে মানে কাজ বাজ করো, কন্ট্রিবিউশন করো, এটা সেপারেট প্রপার্টি ট্রিটেড হবে, তোমার ইনকাম তোমার, আমার ইনকাম আমার। আবার কারোর ইনকাম কারোর সাথে কমিঙ্গলিং করবে না, কমিঙ্গলিং কথাটা মিশ্রিত করলে আবার এটা ম্যারিটাল প্রপার্টিতে হয়ে যায়, সেটা করবে না। আর যদি করা হয় সেটা ক্লেম করা যাবে না, পরের একটা শেয়ার করা যাবে। এই আলো এর থেকে আপনি সব ওয়েব করতে পারেন। যেমন ডিভোর্স হয়ে গেলে যে আমি খরপোশ দিতে পারবো না, আমিও চাবো না, তুমিও চাবা না, এটা এনফোর্স করা যায়। ডিভোর্সের মানে বিয়েকালীন সময়ও আমরা একজন যার যার সাপোর্ট সেই দেবো, এর ইন্স্যুরেন্স প্রিমিয়াম দেব না, তোমারটা নেব না, আমি একটা যার যারটা রেসপেক্টিভ ওয়েতে রাখবো। এই হলো চুক্তি। এর পিরিনাপ, নাপশাল তো বিবাহ, পিরিনাপ মানে বিয়ের আগের চুক্তি, দুইজনে স্বামী স্ত্রী, এই সমস্ত চুক্তি ইসের পরেও করা যায়, বিয়ের পরেও করা যায়। একটা হলো পিরিনাপ আর একটা হলো পোস্ট নাপশাল এগ্রিমেন্ট। এইটা চুক্তি এদেশে ভ্যালিড, এটা হলো চুক্তি, এইটা কোনো রিলিজিয়াস না।
রাইট। সো শেখ সালিম,
দুইজনের ভিতরে চুক্তি এবং চুক্তি আইন অনুযায়ী, টার্মস অনুযায়ী এইটা বলবৎ করা যায়। এই
এখন একটা প্রাসঙ্গিক প্রশ্ন করি, আপনি কি মনে করেন আমাদের কমিউনিটিতে বিয়ের আগে যদি কেউ প্রিনাপটা আলোচনায় নিয়ে আসে, সেই বিয়ে কি হবে?
ওয়েল দ্যাটস খুবই সামাজিক আর মানে কমিউনিটি বেস করবে, কিন্তু হচ্ছে আমি আপনারে বলি
ভালো কথা,
এটা হচ্ছে। আমি নিজেও এটা করেছি, বহু আগেই করেছি।
আপনি একটু বেশি কাছে চলে এসেছেন।
আচ্ছা, এটা হচ্ছে এখন, বিশেষ করে ইয়াং জেনারেশন অনেক করতেছে এটা, বুঝছেন?
আমার মনে হয় আপনি ওই বিয়ের কথা শুনে উত্তেজিত হয়ে খুব কাছে চলে এসেছেন ক্যামেরার।
ক্যামেরার কাছে চলে আসছি
না, এখন ঠিক আছে। আচ্ছা, তাহলে we are towards the end of our show for tonight at least.
Yes.
Do you have any advice for both sides, tenants and the landlord, how to safeguard themselves when they're getting into a new lease or renewing a lease?
Consult an attorney and make sure that your lease is
that's for sure.
that your lease is kosher, as they say. I mean, safeguard. Look, you know, the lease is a contract, and you can't just. Neither party can breach the contract.
Right.
So if you have a breach of a lease, or if you have a fundamental breach of the lease, then that's actionable. The fact of the matter is that, again, both parties have rights. The tenants have rights, and the landlords have rights. You should be aware of those rights. And so, you know, if there are issues with a tenant, or if you have issues with your landlord, then definitely consult an attorney, because the landlords can't do anything that's illegal to expedite or force you to leave. That would be considered harassment, and that's a violation of the New York City rules and regulations, as well as the Housing Maintenance Code. And simultaneously, tenants can't behave in ways that are objectionable, that cause a nuisance, that cause problems. The landlords would be able to evict you on that basis as well.
Thank you so much. Attorney Sheikh Salim, আপনার কাছ থেকে বিদায় নিচ্ছি। আপনি ভালো থাকবেন, পরবর্তীতে দেখা হবে আপনার সাথে। Richard Zarco, I'm going to say goodbye to you for tonight.
Yes.
We'll meet again, and we will again pick up where we left off and go into a different topic altogether.
Well.
I really appreciate you coming here, sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
I'm really hoping that a lot of people got something out of it.
I hope so too.
Okay.
I hope I didn't overdo it or overtalk or confuse anybody in the process.
No, we're going to go over it again. They're going to hear you again. And দর্শক, আপনারা যারা এতক্ষণ অনুষ্ঠানটি দেখছিলেন, আজকের মতো এখানেই বিদায় নিব। সবাই ভালো থাকবেন, শুভরাত্রি।
TBN 24 টেলিভিশন দেখতে আজই কল করুন 7187776556। লগ ইন করুন www.totalcablebd.com।
নিউ ইয়র্ক থেকে সম্প্রচারিত TBN 24 টেলিভিশন, বিশ্বজুড়ে বাঙালির কণ্ঠস্বর।